Hi, I'm Spiro with SP Wood Art, and thank you very much for joining me today. If you have not subscribed, please feel free to do so. And as always, I always welcome any questions or comments you may have. So today I'm going to experiment and make a small 6-inch bud vase with a glass insert tube. It will be artistic. It's SP Wood Art, and I like to make artistic projects. I always consider myself more of an artist than I do a woodworker, and I also like my projects to be somewhat functional. So I hope you stick with me to the end and enjoy the show. Thanks. Since this is an experimental project, I'm going to start with some cheaper poplar wood, American poplar wood. It is 6 7/8 inches by 2 3/8. This piece was already prepped to be a bowl and has a hole for my woodworm screw. So if you do choose this method of mounting, you're going to want to measure your woodworm screw to make sure you account for that depth, because you don't want to turn and end up hitting your woodworm screw later. Or if you choose to use a sacrificial piece of wood, you can ignore this section. The design consists of 3 rings. The outer diameter is 6 5/8 inches. The outer ring is a 1/2 inch thick. The top ring space is 5/8 inches, and the middle ring is 3/4 inches. The space below that is a 1/2 inch, and a 1/2 inch for the center ring, and a 1/2 inch for the center of the center ring. Whew, that was a lot. Here's my pattern transferred, and these measurements are for half the circumference, and they'll be doubled for the inner circumference between the outer ring from top and bottom. For example, the space above the middle ring is 5/8 inch thick, and that's doubled when that middle ring drops down and sits on the bottom ring. So the space above the middle ring at its high point will then be 1 1/4 inches wide. So no matter what design you choose, just keep in mind that you need to factor in the space in between the rings, their thickness, and the thickness of the rings. And here is some of the glass tubes with a rim lip on the top that I've gotten from Craft Supply online, and I'm going to use the smaller diameter, which is a little less than 6 inches long. And again, depending on your design, you want to make sure you factor the length of your tube with the rings. As with mine, I'm going to make sure that the end of the tube is embedded into the middle ring when the rings drop down. You also want to factor in the width of your ring to make sure that there's space on either side of your tube. Here I've cut off the corners and rounded them over on my belt sander, and notice that there is a crack that sort of goes through the blank, so I'm going to use some thin viscosity CA glue or cyanoacrylate or super glue just to make sure that this bowl doesn't come apart on me. I'll start using my 5/8 inch bowl gouge to turn the blank round. I'll soften the corners before I start doing some more aggressive push cuts. And just in case I didn't mention it before, this is kiln dried wood. And with these ring projects, you definitely want to make sure that the outside is pretty square with the face of the rings. And I'm just using a square carbide cutter here to try and make it as flat and square as possible. Now, before you square the face of the blank off, you want to use a parting tool and cut your measurement lines in so they're there and your pencil lines don't disappear, and then you have to make your measurements all over again. Not that I'm speaking from experience with this. Now you can go ahead and finish off the face of the blank to make sure that it's nice and flat and square. And again, I'm using my square carbide cutter here and trying to make it as flat as possible. It's not quite flat yet, but it's close. It's a little concaved in the middle, so I'm gonna keep working at it. And we have a winner. And I will triple check using a square to make sure that it is 90 degrees. This is an important step or the vase won't look quite right when it's sitting on a table. And I just need a little off the top back, and that is pretty square. Now before I drill the hole with this 7/8 inch Fosner bit for the lip of the glass tube, I need to find the center of the ring width between the woodworm screw depth and the outer edge of the ring. And you'll also want to make sure that your bit is aligned vertically with the center of your entire blank. You should also drill a little bit deeper than the lip of the glass tube, that way there's room for sanding later. And that is a really good fit. Now I needed to use an 11/16 inch bit for the tube, and the only thing I had on hand was this spade bit. It's not my preferred method, but that's all I had in that size. It did get the job done, but if you have the choice, either use a drill bit or a Fosner bit. Moving on to the wonderful world of sanding, and I started with 80 grit and went up to 600. I was having a tough time with the outer edge, and I actually eventually resorted to power sanding and then finished up to 600 grit. I was having a bear of a time with that end grain. Next, I'm just going to mark my parting tool. This is a 1/2 inch parting tool for the depth. When you cut the space for the rings, you definitely want to make sure you make relief cuts as you're going, because you have to go pretty deep in here. And when you get a little far, especially with this 1/2 inch parting tool past the tool rest, it gets a little grabby. If you have a parting tool with like a 20 inch long handle, I would definitely recommend using that. Also, as you're cutting in, you want to try and be as straight as possible so the inside of the ring is pretty flat and perpendicular to the outside ring. It'll just save you from less sanding later on the inside of the ring. And unfortunately, the crack is pretty flexible here since I've kind of parted the ring a little, and I need to add more super glue, which means then I'm going to have to finish the outside again and resand. Now I can continue on marking the depth of the outer ring and then parting the first ring off the blank. Here I'm going to clean out the outside of the second ring now, and I'm going to turn as I go as much of that back plate off as possible because that could be a knuckle bruiser. And once again I had to add more CA glue on the second ring to help stabilize these ongoing cracks throughout this piece of poplar. And then you'll also want to make sure that the second ring is 90 degrees and square. Then once you cleaned up the outer side of this ring and sanded it up to 600 grit, I can measure the width of the second ring using the first ring. Then I moved on to clearing out the second space between the last two rings. I know I mentioned this in the beginning of the video, but you definitely want to make sure that you're not going to hit your woodworm screw when you're turning. And here's another good tip. You can use a piece of flat wood and just put some sandpaper on it, and that'll help to give you a flat surface when you're sanding. Next, once you finish parting off the last ring, I'm going to move over to my belt sander and clean up the backs of the rings. The large outer ring, the middle ring, and then the center smaller ring. And then I will use my drum sander on my drill press to clean up the insides of the two largest rings and then hand sand the rest of the insides. Now to enhance my design and add a little flair, if you will, and also cover up the woodworm screw hole that is in the center ring, I'm going to cut a piece of this half-inch aluminum rod. And just to note, if you're going to sand the ends flat like I am here on a belt sander, the metal gets pretty hot, so either wear gloves or don't stay on the sandpaper for very long. Now I'll cut two plugs off, one on each side of the aluminum piece. One has a burr from the cut and the other one has been sanded. The sanded sides will fit easily into the half-inch hole, which I'm going to drill in the center ring on each side. Note, don't drill all the way through, or well, you can, but you can't have the rod going all the way through because of the glass tube. Well, that was completely unexpected. Just goes to show you never know what can happen. But luckily, I was able to salvage the piece. It was a clean break, and I was able to just glue the pieces back together, and it looks like a natural crack. Here is the fixed centerpiece, and now I'm just going to use some medium viscosity CA glue to hammer in the aluminum rod plugs. Then I'll move over to the belt sander and sand the aluminum rod flush with the face of the ring. And while I'm waiting for that aluminum rod to cool down, it got pretty hot on the belt sander, I'm going to mix up a bright, vibrant green using a yellow alcohol artisan wood dye. And this is a bluish green turquoise. I'm going to add a little bit. And I'll mix that up to get that green vibrant color that I'm looking for. As far as the measurement, it would be 2/3 yellow, 1/3 bluish green. And to apply the dye, I'm just using a spongy makeup wedge, which soaks up the dye really well and spreads it out nice and evenly. I use these all the time for applying dye to wood. And I'll continue dyeing the other two rings, and I will also dye right over the aluminum rod, and I'll clean that up later when the dye dries. After a day has passed and the dye is completely dry, I'll use this Titebond 2 wood glue to glue the rings in place. Since this bud vase is going to be handled a lot, I really wanted the glue joints to be strong. Then I'll clamp up the rings and leave it overnight to dry. Here is the next day, and I'll take the clamps off. I did leave the glass tube in there to stabilize the rings, but I am pretty sure that the glue did not adhere to the glass. Now I'm going to sand the bottom of the ring flat, and you really want this in line with the glass tube so the vase sits properly and you don't have water spilling out or your flowers tipping over or anything like that. I also added a temporary wooden dowel through the glass tube hole to assist me in sanding and to help me keep the vase aligned. Here's a shot of the bottom, and it's not the whole bottom, but it's enough where it will sit very stable. And then I'm just going to hand sand the bottom up to 600 grit. This is where I'll use 91% alcohol on a Q-tip and remove the dye from the aluminum rod. And also I will apply the dye to the base and let that dry for another 24 hours. Then when the die is dry, a day later, I will apply 3 coats of this Krylon matte acrylic spray and let that dry. It takes about an hour to dry in between coats, or at least that's what I do. And for the next step, I'm going to knock down the acrylic spray, and to even it out, make sure there's no dust or bubbles or anything on the finish, using these 3M like Scotch Brite kind of pads. It's just like steel wool, but it doesn't leave any little steel wool around on the... I like them better than steel wool. Then for the final step, I'm going to apply 3 more coats of the Krylon acrylic matte spray, and on the final coat I'll let that dry for several hours, and then I'll give it a light sand and then lightly buff it out. Though this was just an experiment and I was trying out a new design, but I'm pleased with the design and the overall result. I definitely would use a different type of wood. I had a lot of issues with this piece because of those cracks and with the center ring blowing up on the drill press. So please subscribe if you haven't, and thank you for watching.